Hello friends, and welcome back to The Snoozy Scientist, where we drift through the mysteries of deep time, one gentle discovery at a time. Tonight, we'll be traveling back to a moment that changed everything. A single day that ended an era spanning more than 160 million years, when giants walked the earth and ruled both land and sky. Picture, if you will, a world where thunderous footsteps shake the ground beneath towering ferns, where the roar of a Tyrannosaurus rex echoes across vast river plains, and pterosaurs with wingspans wider than school buses soar through humid skies. This was Earth 66 million years ago, a planet so alien to our own that it feels like stepping into a living dream. Yet it was real, vibrant, and teeming with life in forms we can barely imagine. The dinosaurs had ruled for longer than mammals have existed. They had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and shifts in climate that would have broken lesser creatures. They had evolved into forms both delicate and massive, from feathered hunters no bigger than ravens, to long-necked giants that could graze from treetops 4 stories high. They seemed eternal, as though they would stride across the continents forever. But eternity, as we know, is a word that belongs only to stones and stars. On one particular day in late spring, 66 million years ago, the age of dinosaurs came to an end, not gradually, but in a single, catastrophic moment that rewrote the story of life on Earth. Before we begin this journey into that final day, if you enjoy drifting through time with gentle science stories that invite rest rather than demand attention, a like and subscribe would mean the world to me. It helps others find these quiet explorations, and it helps this channel grow into the peaceful corner of curiosity it was meant to be. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what draws you to these ancient mysteries. It's always wonderful to see how far these stories travel. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and let's step quietly into that distant morning when the world was about to change forever. The sun rose over what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula, much as it had for millions of mornings before. Its light filtered through a canopy of primitive flowering plants and ancient conifers, casting dappled shadows across a landscape that hummed with life. The air was thick and warm, heavy with moisture from shallow seas that covered much of what would one day become North America. This was a greenhouse world, where palm trees grew near the poles, and ice was all but unknown. In the shadows of those ancient forests, creatures stirred that have no equal in our modern world. A triceratops, massive as an elephant, but armed with horns longer than a human body, grazed peacefully on ferns beside a meandering stream. Its 3-horned skull, adorned with a bony frill that caught the morning light, turned slowly as it sensed movement in the undergrowth. But there was no immediate danger, only the rustle of smaller dinosaurs foraging among the fallen logs. Nearby, a herd of Edmontosaurus, duck-billed giants with sophisticated social bonds, moved through clearings created by their own endless appetite for vegetation. Their calls, deep and resonant, carried across miles of forest and prairie. These were not the simple beasts of popular imagination, but complex animals with intricate behaviors, family structures, and perhaps even primitive forms of culture passed down through generations. Above them, in the filtered sunlight of the canopy, smaller dinosaurs lived lives of delicate beauty. Feathered creatures no larger than chickens flitted between branches, their iridescent plumage catching light in ways that would have dazzled any observer. Some were learning to fly, their wings still clumsy but determined. Others had already mastered the art, soaring between trees with grace that would inspire the birds of the future. And somewhere in the deeper shadows, where the forest floor was carpeted with rotting leaves and ancient cycads, moved the apex predator of this world, Tyrannosaurus rex, a name that would one day mean tyrant king, though no human throat had yet spoken those words. At 40 feet long and weighing as much as a city bus, it was a creature built for power. Its massive skull, armed with teeth like railroad spikes, could crush bone with a bite force that still holds records among land animals. Yet for all its fearsome reputation, T-Rex was also a parent, a social creature that lived in the family groups and cared for its young with the tenderness that evolution writes into all successful species. This particular morning found one such Tyrannosaur, a mature female, leading her 2 half-grown offspring through territory she had known for years. Her massive feet, each armed with claws that could disembowel a rival, stepped carefully around the smaller creatures that shared her world. She was not the mindless destroyer of Hollywood imagination, but a careful predator who understood that a broken ecosystem meant starvation for all who lived within it. The 3 tyrannosaurs paused beside a river that wound lazily through the landscape, its waters warm and clear. Fish swam in its depths, primitive ancestors of modern species, while crocodilians that would have dwarfed their modern descendants basked on muddy banks. The scene was peaceful, almost pastoral, despite the presence of predators that could have torn apart a modern elephant. As the morning wore on, other dramas played out across this ancient stage. Herds of Parasaurolophus, crested duckbills whose hollow head ornaments served as musical instruments, filled the air with haunting calls that resonated like organ pipes. Their songs carried information about food sources, potential mates, and dangers that lurked in the shadows. It was a complex symphony of survival, played out in frequencies and harmonies that no human ear would ever hear. In clearings where ancient rivers had changed course, leaving behind rich soil, herds of Ankylosaurus grazed like living tanks. Their bodies, armoured with bony plates and ending in massive clubs that could shatter the leg bones of even the largest predators, moved with surprising grace. Despite their fearsome appearance, they were gentle giants, using their powerful beaks to crop vegetation with the patience of gardeners. The sky above this verdant world was ruled by creatures that challenged the very definition of possibility. Quetzalcoatlus, a pterosaur with wings that spanned nearly 40 feet, soared on thermals with the effortless grace of a hang glider. These were not flying reptiles in the clumsy sense we might imagine, but sophisticated aerial predators whose mastery of flight would not be matched by any creature until the evolution of the great albatrosses. Their hollow bones and precise muscle control allowed them to stay aloft for hours, scanning the landscape below for carrion or unwary prey. Smaller pterosaurs filled ecological niches that would later be occupied by birds, some diving for fish in shallow lagoons, others picking insects from the bark of ancient trees. The air itself was alive with movement, from tiny flying reptiles no larger than sparrows to giants that cast shadows like small aircraft. But perhaps most remarkable of all were the dinosaurs that had already begun the long evolutionary journey toward becoming birds. Creatures with asymmetrical flight feathers and hollow bones lived in the forest canopy, their lives split between the security of branches and the freedom of open sky. They were dinosaurs still, but dinosaurs in transition, carrying within their bodies the genetic blueprints for a future they would never see, but their descendants would inherit. This was the world as it existed on that final morning, a world of impossible beauty and complexity. Every niche was filled, every ecological role occupied by creatures that had been perfected by millions of years of evolution. The dinosaurs had not simply survived since the Triassic period. They had thrived, diversified, and created ecosystems of staggering sophistication. In the shallow seas that bordered these ancient continents, marine reptiles ruled as completely as dinosaurs dominated the land. Mosasaurs, massive sea serpents with flippers and skulls filled with sharp teeth, cruised through warm waters, hunting ammonites whose spiral shells caught the filtered sunlight like living jewels. These ocean predators, some reaching lengths of 50 feet, were the undisputed masters of their realm. Apex predators in seas that teemed with life. Plesiosaurs, with their impossibly long necks and powerful flippers, moved through deeper waters like underwater giraffes, their small heads darting forward to snatch fish and squid. Their grace in water was matched only by their helplessness on land, a trade-off that had served them well for millions of years, but would prove catastrophic in the hours to come. Even the microscopic life of this ancient world was fundamentally different from our own. Plankton drifted in vast blooms, their shells contributing to limestone deposits that would one day form the white cliffs of Dover. These tiny organisms, invisible to the naked eye but present in numbers that defied comprehension, formed the foundation of food webs that supported everything from the smallest fish to the largest marine reptiles. The very air these creatures breathed was richer in oxygen than our own, allowing for the gigantism that characterized so many species of the late Cretaceous. This oxygen-rich atmosphere had shaped evolution in ways both subtle and profound, permitting the existence of creatures whose very survival depended on atmospheric conditions that were about to change forever. As the sun climbed higher in that ancient sky, painting the landscape in shades of green and gold that no human eye would ever witness, the stage was set for transformation. This was not just any day in the Mesozoic era, but the last day, the final chapter in a story that had begun when the first dinosaurs emerged from the shadows of more ancient reptiles. The creatures living through these final hours had no awareness of their place in history. They knew only the eternal present of survival, the endless cycle of hunting and being hunted, of growth and reproduction, of adaptation and change that had carried their lineages through countless generations. They were the culmination of evolutionary processes so vast and patient that they seemed to promise continuation without end. Yet, even as they went about their ancient routines, forces beyond their comprehension were already in motion. High above the atmosphere, invisible to even the keenest eyes of the pterosaurs, an object approached that would rewrite the rules of existence on Earth. It carried with it the power to end not just individual lives, but entire evolutionary lineages, to close chapters in the book of life that had been writing themselves for millions of years. The morning advanced peacefully, marked by the same rhythms that had governed life for eons. Predators stalked prey through dappled shadows. Herbivores grazed in clearings where ancient flowers bloomed, and in the canopy above, the first true birds sang songs that carried melodies forward into a future they could not imagine. None of these creatures could have known that this day would be different from any other in the long history of their kind. The Tyrannosaur matriarch lifted her massive head to taste the air, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of something unusual carried on the wind. It was not the familiar musk of prey or the warning pheromones of rivals, but something else entirely, something that stirred an unease she could not name. Her offspring sensed her tension and pressed closer, their own senses alert, but finding nothing concrete to fear. The morning breeze carried the usual symphony of forest sounds, the distant calls of hadrosaurs, the splash of fish jumping in the river, the rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth. Yet something felt different, as though the very air itself held a quality of anticipation. Miles above their heads, invisible against the blue dome of sky, a visitor from the deep reaches of space continued its silent approach. It had been falling toward Earth for millions of years, a wanderer from the asteroid belt that had been nudged from its ancient orbit by the gravitational dance of planets. Now, in these final hours, it began to feel the first whisper-thin touch of Earth's atmosphere. The object was not large as cosmic bodies go, perhaps 6 miles across, a mountain of rock and metal that would have fit comfortably within the boundaries of a small city. But it carried with it the kinetic energy of eons, the accumulated momentum of a journey that had begun in the dim reaches between Mars and Jupiter. Moving at speeds that defied earthly comprehension, it held within its dark mass the power to reshape continents and rewrite the story of life itself. Back in the Cretaceous forests, life continued its ancient patterns, unaware of the approaching transformation. A group of Parasaurolophus had gathered near a bend in the river where the current had deposited a rich layer of sediment, perfect for the growth of the horsetail plants they favoured. Their crests, those magnificent hollow tubes of bone that served as resonating chambers, caught the morning light as they called to one another in voices that would have sounded like brass instruments played by giants. The herd moved with the fluid coordination of creatures that had lived together for years, each individual aware of its place in the social hierarchy while remaining alert to the needs of the group. Mothers kept their young close, while the dominant males stationed themselves at the edges of the gathering, their senses tuned to any hint of danger that might approach through the forest shadows. In those shadows, smaller dramas played out with equal intensity. A pack of Troodon, intelligent predators no larger than wolves, but armed with sickle-shaped claws and minds sharp enough to solve complex problems, stalked through the underbrush in pursuit of early mammals. These were not the simple, instinct-driven hunters of popular imagination, but creatures capable of learning, of adapting their strategies, of working together with a sophistication that would not be matched by mammalian predators for millions of years. Their quarry, a primitive mammal about the size of a modern raccoon, had survived the age of dinosaurs through stealth and cunning. It knew every hollow log, every root tangle, every secret pathway through the forest floor. Its survival depended on remaining invisible, on moving through a world of giants without attracting the attention of creatures that could end its life with a single snap of powerful jaws. High above this terrestrial drama, the pterosaurs continued their eternal patrol of the skies. A pair of pteranodon, their 7-foot wingspans carrying them effortlessly on the warm updrafts, circled above the river in search of fish. Their hollow bones and precisely calibrated muscle systems allowed them to hang motionless in the air, riding the wind with a mastery that would inspire human dreams of flight for millions of years to come. These flying reptiles were not merely surviving, but thriving in their aerial domain. Some had evolved to fill niches that would later be occupied by everything from hummingbirds to condors, from fishing eagles to seed-dispersing fruit bats. The sky itself was an ecosystem as complex and vibrant as any terrestrial forest, filled with creatures whose mastery of three-dimensional space had reached levels of sophistication that challenged the very limits of what vertebrate flight could achieve. But even as these ancient aviators rode the thermals with supreme confidence, the upper atmosphere above them was beginning to change. At the very edge of space, where the thin air gave way to the vacuum between worlds, the first wisps of vapor began to form around the approaching asteroid. The friction of its passage through even the thinnest atmosphere was beginning to heat its surface, though it would be hours yet before any earthbound creature could see the first faint glow of its arrival. In the shallow seas that bordered the continents, the marine reptiles continued their own ancient routines. A massive mosasaurus, 40 feet of streamlined predatory power, cruised through warm waters in search of the ammonites that formed a significant part of its diet. These spiral-shelled cephalopods, some as large as truck tires, drifted through the water column like living submarines, their jet propulsion systems allowing them to escape all but the most determined predators. The mosasaur's paddle-like limbs cut through the water with barely a ripple, its body moving with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. Its massive skull, armed with teeth designed for crushing shells and bones, turned slowly as it scanned the water around it. These marine giants were the undisputed rulers of their realm, apex predators that had evolved from land-dwelling lizards over millions of years of patient adaptation. Beneath them, in the deeper waters where sunlight faded to blue twilight, other marine reptiles pursued their own survival strategies. Long-necked plesiosaurs used their flexible necks like underwater serpents, darting their small heads forward to snatch fish and squid with lightning precision. Their 4 powerful flippers, evolved from the legs of terrestrial ancestors, propelled them through the water with a grace that belied their massive size. Schools of primitive fish, ancestors of modern species but strange in their own right, moved through these ancient seas in clouds of silver that caught and scattered the filtered sunlight. Some had evolved defensive strategies that would persist for millions of years, forming tight balls when threatened, or developing poisonous spines that deterred all but the most desperate predators. Even the coral reefs of this ancient world were different from anything in our modern oceans. Rudis bivalves, massive shell-forming creatures that could grow to the size of bathtubs, had taken over the reef-building role that would later be filled by corals. These ancient shellfish created underwater cities of calcium carbonate, providing shelter and hunting grounds for countless smaller species. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher in that ancient sky, the rhythms of life continued uninterrupted. Tidal pools along the coastlines teemed with early crabs and primitive mollusks, while sea turtles the size of small cars hauled themselves onto beaches to lay eggs in sand that would never see the footprints of human beings. The very plants that formed the foundation of these ecosystems were different from our modern flora, though recognizable in their basic forms. Flowering plants, or angiosperms, were still relatively new arrivals on the evolutionary stage, having appeared only about 40 million years earlier. They were in the process of diversifying rapidly, filling ecological niches with an explosive creativity that would reshape terrestrial ecosystems forever. Ancient magnolias bloomed in clearings where dinosaur herds had trampled the ground, their large primitive flowers designed to attract beetles rather than the bees and butterflies that would evolve later. Fig trees, among the earliest flowering plants, were already beginning their long partnership with specialized wasps, a relationship so intricate and interdependent that it would survive the coming catastrophe and persist into our modern world. Ferns, those ancient masters of the forest understory, carpeted the ground in green tapestries of incredible diversity. Some grew as tall as trees, their fronds creating canopies within canopies, while others remained small and delicate, finding their niches in the shadows of giants. These were the plants that had fed the great herbivorous dinosaurs, converting sunlight into the biomass that supported entire food webs. In clearings where lightning strikes or dinosaur activities had created openings in the forest canopy, grasses were beginning their own evolutionary experiment. These humble plants, which would one day transform entire continents and support human civilization, were still in their infancy, competing with ferns and early flowers for space and sunlight. The trees themselves told stories of adaptation and survival that stretched back millions of years. Conifers, the giants of the Mesozoic forests, had evolved forms and strategies that seemed almost designed to support the enormous herbivores that browsed among them. Some had developed toxic compounds in their needles, others had grown beyond the reach of all but the longest-necked sauropods, creating vertical gardens in their crowns. Ginkgos, those living fossils that would survive the coming catastrophe and persist unchanged into our modern world, rustled in the warm breeze with fan-shaped leaves that had remained virtually identical for millions of years. They were already ancient when the first dinosaurs emerged, and they would be ancient still when the last dinosaur drew its final breath. As the day advanced and shadows began to shorten under the climbing sun, the first subtle changes in the upper atmosphere went unnoticed by the creatures below. The asteroid, still hours away from impact, had begun to interact more significantly with the thin gases at the edge of space. Its surface temperature was rising as friction heated the dark rock, though it would be much longer before this heating became visible as the bright streak that would herald the end of an age. The forests and plains of the late Cretaceous world continued their ancient dance of life and death, growth and decay, adaptation and change. Somewhere in the shadows, an aging triceratops took its last breath, its massive body settling into the soft earth, where it would become food for countless smaller creatures. Nearby, a clutch of Maiasaura eggs began to hatch, tiny dinosaurs emerging into a world that seemed as eternal and unchanging as the stones beneath their feet. These newborn hadrosaurs no larger than house cats but already perfectly formed miniatures of their parents, took their first tentative steps on legs that would one day carry them across vast migrations. Their eyes, bright and alert, saw a world painted in colours that no human artist could capture. The greens of their forest home ranged from the deep emerald of ancient conifers to the pale jade of new fern fronds, while flowers bloomed in shades that existed nowhere in our modern spectrum. Their mother, a massive Maiasaura, whose name would one day mean good mother lizard, watched over them with the fierce protectiveness that evolution had written into her genetic code. She had chosen this nesting site carefully, in a clearing where the morning sun would warm her eggs, but the afternoon shade would prevent them from overheating. Around her, dozens of other mothers tended their own broods, creating a nursery colony that hummed with the soft chirps and calls of infant dinosaurs. This communal nesting behavior was one of the many sophisticated social strategies that had allowed dinosaurs to dominate their world for so long. Like modern birds, they understood that cooperation in child rearing increased survival rates, that the many eyes and ears of a colony could detect threats that might slip past a solitary parent. The adults took turns standing guard while others foraged, their massive bodies forming living walls between their young and the dangers that lurked in the forest shadows. In those very shadows, other dramas of birth and death played out with equal intensity. A pack of Deinonychus, those terrible clawed predators whose discovery would one day revolutionize our understanding of dinosaur behavior, moved through the undergrowth with the coordinated precision of wolves. Their sickle-shaped killing claws, held high off the ground to keep them razor-sharp, caught occasional flecks of sunlight as they stalked their quarry. These were not the cold-blooded monsters of old Hollywood films, but warm-blooded predators whose intelligence and social cooperation rivaled that of modern mammals. They communicated through subtle body language and quiet vocalizations, their feathered bodies allowing them to move through dense vegetation with surprising stealth. Each member of the pack knew its role, whether as the primary attacker, the herder, who would drive prey toward the others, or the sentinel who watched for larger predators that might threaten the group. Their target was a solitary Thescelosaurus, a small ornithopod dinosaur about the size of a large dog that had wandered too far from its own kind while foraging for tender shoots. The plant-eater's survival depended on vigilance and speed. But in the dense forest where sight lines were short and sounds were muffled by vegetation, even the most alert prey could find itself in mortal danger within seconds. The hunt that followed was a masterpiece of predatory coordination, played out in near silence beneath the cathedral canopy of ancient trees. The Deinonychus pack moved like shadows given form, each individual taking position with the patience of creatures who understood that a single mistake could mean the difference between a successful hunt and starvation. Their amber eyes, bright with intelligence, tracked every movement of their prey, while their minds calculated angles of attack and escape routes. But this was more than mere predation. It was part of an ecological web so complex and interconnected that the removal of any single thread could cause the entire tapestry to unravel. The Deinonychus pack served not only their own survival needs, but also the health of the herbivore populations they hunted. By culling the sick, the old, and the unwary, they ensured that only the strongest and most adaptable individuals passed their genes to the next generation. High above this terrestrial drama, the sky told its own stories of adaptation and survival. A flock of Hesperornis, flightless diving birds with teeth still visible in their elongated beaks, rode the swells of a shallow inland sea. These were dinosaurs in the process of becoming something entirely new, creatures caught between their reptilian past and their avian future. Their wings had been reduced to mere stubs, sacrificed in favor of powerful legs and streamlined bodies that made them masters of the underwater realm. They dove for fish with the precision of living torpedoes, their sleek forms cutting through the warm water as they pursued schools of primitive bony fish. these ancient seas teemed with life forms that existed nowhere in our modern oceans, creating feeding opportunities that would vanish forever when the coming catastrophe reshaped the marine environment. The very chemistry of these ancient waters was different from our modern seas. Higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had made the oceans more acidic, yet life had adapted to these conditions over millions of years. Microscopic plankton with shells of calcium carbonate drifted in vast blooms, their tiny bodies forming the foundation of food webs that supported everything from the smallest fish to the largest marine reptiles. In the deepest parts of these shallow seas, where the water was still warm enough to support tropical life forms, massive ammonites pursued their own ancient strategies for survival. Some had shells coiled tight like ram's horns. Others had evolved straight shells that made them look like swimming ice cream cones. Their shells, works of mathematical precision that would inspire human engineers millions of years in the future, provided both protection and buoyancy control in the three-dimensional world of the ocean. These cephalopods, distant relatives of modern squid and octopi, possessed intelligence that rivaled many vertebrates. They could change color for camouflage, solve simple problems, and even use tools in ways that suggested complex thought processes. Their eyes, as large as dinner plates in the biggest species, could detect the faintest movements in the blue-green twilight of their underwater world. As the morning progressed toward noon, the sun climbed higher in a sky that held no trace of clouds. The atmosphere was stable, humid, and rich with the oxygen that allowed such gigantic creatures to thrive. Weather patterns moved across the continents in slow, predictable cycles that had remained essentially unchanged for millions of years. There were no ice caps to disrupt ocean currents, no frozen poles to create the complex weather systems that would characterize later geological periods. This climatic stability had been one of the keys to dinosaur success. Generations could pass without significant environmental changes, allowing species to fine-tune their adaptations to specific niches. Evolution could work with the patience of geological time, crafting solutions to survival challenges with a precision that seemed almost artistic in its elegance. In the forests where humidity levels remained constant year-round, ecosystems had developed relationships of stunning complexity. Fig wasps, tiny insects no larger than gnats, had evolved alongside their host trees in partnerships so intricate that neither could survive without the other. Each species of fig had its own species of wasp, and each wasp had evolved to pollinate only its specific fig tree. This mutual dependence created webs of interaction that linked hundreds of species in chains of survival. Flowering plants were experimenting with partnerships of their own, evolving bright colors and sweet nectar to attract the beetles and primitive flies that served as their pollinators. These early flowers were large and simple compared to their modern descendants, but they represented a revolutionary new strategy in plant reproduction. Instead of relying on wind to carry their pollen, they had learned to bribe mobile creatures to do the work for them. The insects of the Cretaceous world were themselves marvels of evolution, having already diversified into most of the major groups that exist today. Primitive ants built their first colonies in rotting logs, while early bees learned to collect pollen and nectar with increasing efficiency. Dragonflies with wingspans that dwarfed their modern relatives patrolled the edges of rivers and lakes, their compound eyes capable of tracking the smallest movements with lethal precision. Butterflies, those living flowers of the insect world, had only recently evolved from their moth ancestors. Their wings, painted in patterns that would inspire human artists for millennia to come, carried them between the primitive flowers in a dance of mutual benefit. Each species had evolved wing patterns and flight behaviors that allowed them to exploit specific ecological niches, from the forest canopy where they sipped nectar from tall blooms to the forest floor where they fed on rotting fruit and dung. In the soil beneath all this visible life, another world thrived in darkness. Earthworms, springtails, and countless species of bacteria worked to break down the constant rain of organic matter that fell from above. Fungal networks spread through the root systems of trees, creating communication pathways that allowed entire forests to share nutrients and information. These underground communities were as complex and vital as anything living in the sunlight above. The rivers and streams that wound through these ancient landscapes carried more than water. They transported sediments that would one day become the rock formations where paleontologists would discover the fossilized remains of this lost world. Each flood deposited new layers of mud and sand, creating the geological pages where the story of the late Cretaceous would be preserved for future discovery. Along the banks of these waterways, evidence of dinosaur life accumulated in forms that would survive the coming catastrophe. Footprints pressed into soft mud told stories of herds on migration, of predators stalking prey, of young animals learning to walk beside their parents. Coprolites, fossilized dung, would preserve detailed records of what these animals ate, while shed teeth and broken bones would provide clues about their growth rates and lifespans. In the deeper pools where the currents slowed, primitive freshwater sharks cruised among schools of early ray-finned fish. These aquatic predators had survived previous mass extinctions and would survive the coming one as well. Their basic body plans so perfectly adapted to their environment that millions of years would pass without significant change. They were living links between the ancient seas where vertebrate life had first evolved and the modern waters where their descendants still hunt today. As the sun reached its zenith in that ancient sky, casting short shadows beneath the towering trees, the pace of life seemed to slow in the growing heat. Many of the larger dinosaurs sought shade during the hottest part of the day, their massive bodies requiring careful temperature regulation to prevent overheating. Tyrannosaurs panted in the shadows like giant dogs, their tongues lolling as they dissipated heat through evaporation. The herbivorous dinosaurs had learned to time their feeding activities to avoid the worst heat, emerging to graze in the early morning and late afternoon when temperatures were more manageable. During the midday hours, they rested in whatever shade they could find, their massive bodies creating microclimates that smaller animals used for their own comfort. Pterosaurs soared higher during these hot hours, riding the thermals that rose from the heated landscape. Their hollow bones and efficient respiratory systems allowed them to function at altitudes where the air was cooler, giving them access to feeding opportunities that ground-bound creatures could never exploit. Some species had evolved to migrate vast distances, following seasonal patterns of food availability with navigation systems that rivaled those of modern birds. But even as life on the surface slowed in the heat, activity continued in the cooler depths of the forests. Small mammals, ancestors of the creatures that would inherit the earth, remained active in the shadows where their fur-covered bodies could better regulate temperature. These early placental and marsupial mammals were already showing signs of the adaptability that would serve them well in the changed world to come. Their keen senses evolved to help them avoid the dinosaurian predators that dominated their world, made them acutely aware of subtle changes in their environment. Some possessed hearing so acute they could detect the ultrasonic calls of early bats, while others had developed night vision that allowed them to forage when most reptiles were sluggish with cold. In the crown of the forest canopy, where the leaves filtered the intense sunlight into a green twilight, early primates made their first tentative experiments with arboreal life. These tiny creatures, no larger than modern mice, possessed grasping hands and forward-facing eyes that would one day evolve into the complex brains and manipulative abilities of their human descendants. But that future lay millions of years away, and for now, they were content to search for insects and fruit among the branches of trees that had never known the touch of an axe. The afternoon heat brought its own rhythm to the ancient world. Insects buzzed in clouds around flowering plants, their activity levels peaking as temperatures rose. Primitive bees, still more wasp-like than their modern descendants, worked frantically to collect pollen and nectar before the day grew too hot for flight. Their fuzzy bodies, covered in branched hairs that trapped pollen grains, made them efficient pollinators despite their primitive social organization. In the shallow lagoons where freshwater met the sea, crocodilians that dwarfed their modern relatives basked in the intense sunlight. These ancient predators, already old when the first dinosaurs appeared, had perfected the art of patient hunting. They could remain motionless for hours, their eyes and nostrils barely breaking the surface, waiting for unwary animals to come within striking distance of their massive jaws. The fish that swam in these waters had evolved their own strategies for avoiding these patient predators. Some had developed armor plating that could turn aside even the most powerful bite, while others relied on speed and agility to escape danger. Schools of primitive herring-like fish moved through the water in synchronized formations that confused predators and reduced the chances that any individual would be caught. Even the plants had evolved defensive strategies against the constant pressure of herbivory. Some produced toxic compounds that made their leaves unpalatable or dangerous to eat, while others grew spines and thorns that discouraged all but the most determined browsers. The evolutionary arms race between plants and their consumers had been running for millions of years, creating a dynamic balance that shaped entire ecosystems. As the day wore on, and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the first imperceptible changes began to occur high above the atmosphere. The asteroid, still hours away from impact, but now close enough to feel the gravitational pull of Earth, began to heat more noticeably as it encountered the thin upper reaches of the atmosphere. Its dark surface, composed of rocky materials and metallic ores, started to glow with a heat that would soon become visible to any creature that happened to look up at just the right moment. But on the surface of the planet below, life continued its ancient patterns, unaware that the very foundations of existence were about to shift. The late afternoon brought a resurgence of activity as temperatures began to drop from their midday peaks. Dinosaur herds emerged from their shaded refuges to resume feeding, their massive jaws working methodically through tons of vegetation as they prepared for the coming night. Predators stirred as well, their internal clocks telling them that the evening hours would bring the best hunting opportunities. The cooler air carried scents more clearly, and the angled light of the afternoon sun created shadows that provided both concealment for hunters and hiding places for prey. The eternal dance of survival was about to begin its final movement, though none of the participants could have imagined that this day's hunt would be their last. The Tyrannosaur matriarch lifted her massive head, nostrils flaring as she tested the air once more. Something had changed in the familiar cocktail of forest scents. Her offspring pressed closer, sensing their mother's unease but finding nothing concrete to fear in the dappled shadows around them. The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating patches of ground where smaller dinosaurs foraged among the ferns and fallen logs. In the distance, a herd of triceratops moved slowly through a clearing, their three-horned skulls bobbing with each deliberate step. These living fortresses, each weighing as much as a modern truck, grazed with the methodical patience of creatures who had no natural enemies save the largest predators. Their bony frills, decorated with intricate patterns unique to each individual, caught the slanted sunlight as they turned their massive heads to crop the tender shoots of early flowering plants. The social bonds among these ceratopsians were as complex as those found in any modern elephant herd. Older individuals led the group to the best feeding sites, their memories holding decades of knowledge about seasonal changes and food availability. Younger animals learned by watching and following, their smaller horns still growing toward the impressive weapons they would one day wield in territorial disputes and mating displays. Nearby, a group of Parasaurolophus had gathered in a natural amphitheater formed by a bend in the river. Their hollow crests, those magnificent resonating chambers, filled the air with haunting calls that carried for miles through the humid atmosphere. Each individual's crest was slightly different, tuned to produce its own unique frequency in the great chorus that bound their species together across vast distances. The songs they sang were not random noise, but complex communications filled with information about food sources, potential dangers, and social relationships. Young animals learned these vocal traditions from their elders, creating cultural transmission of knowledge that spanned generations. Some calls warned of approaching storms, others announced the discovery of rich feeding grounds, and still others served as contact calls that kept scattered family groups in touch across the sprawling landscape. As the afternoon progressed, the sky above began to show the first subtle signs of change. High in the stratosphere, where the atmosphere thinned to almost nothing, wisps of vapor began to form around the approaching asteroid. The friction of its passage through even the most tenuous gases was beginning to heat its surface, though the glow was still too faint to be visible from the ground below. The object itself was unremarkable in cosmic terms, a mountain of rock and metal that had wandered the solar system for billions of years. It carried within its crystalline structure the memory of the early solar system, when planets were still forming and asteroids collided in violent ballet of creation and destruction. Iron and nickel formed its core, surrounded by layers of silicate rock that had been compressed and heated by eons of impacts in the asteroid belt. But size and composition mattered less than velocity. The asteroid was moving at more than 40,000 miles per hour relative to Earth, carrying kinetic energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons. This was not merely a large rock falling from the sky, but a cosmic bullet with the power to crack continents and boil oceans. Back in the Cretaceous forests, life continued its ancient rhythms, unaware of the approaching transformation. A family of Ankylosaurus, those living tanks whose armored hides could turn aside the teeth of the largest predators, moved through a grove of primitive magnolias. Their club-tailed bodies, protected by bony plates and spikes, seemed impregnable against any earthly threat. These gentle giants used their powerful beaks to crop vegetation with surprising delicacy, their small heads belying the intelligence required to navigate complex social relationships within their herds. The youngest member of the group, barely larger than a modern rhinoceros, stayed close to its mother's armored flank. Its own armor was still soft and flexible, requiring the protection of the adults until time and calcium deposits hardened it into the impenetrable shell that defined its kind. The mother's vigilance was constant, her small eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the pack predators that posed the only real threat to a creature of her size and defensive capabilities. In the canopy above, small feathered dinosaurs flitted between branches with increasing agitation. Their acute senses, evolved to detect the slightest changes in their environment, were picking up vibrations and electromagnetic disturbances that had no obvious source. Some took flight in sudden bursts of nervous energy, their iridescent plumage catching the filtered sunlight as they searched for threats that remained stubbornly invisible. These early birds, still carrying many reptilian characteristics in their skeletons and metabolisms, possessed an awareness of their world that extended beyond the five senses familiar to humans. They could detect changes in atmospheric pressure that preceded storms by hours, sense magnetic field fluctuations that guided their migrations, and feel infrasonic vibrations that traveled through the Earth itself. Something was disturbing these subtle environmental cues, creating an unease that rippled through their flocks like wind through wheat. The marine reptiles in the shallow seas were experiencing their own form of disturbance. Mosasaurs, those serpentine rulers of the ancient oceans, found their sonar-like hunting abilities disrupted by strange echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Schools of ammonites, those spiral-shelled masters of buoyancy control, began diving toward deeper waters in response to pressure changes they could feel but not understand. Even the microscopic life of the oceans was responding to alterations in the planet's magnetic field as the massive iron core of the asteroid began to interact with Earth's magnetosphere. Plankton that normally rose to the surface during daylight hours remained in the depths, their navigation systems confused by signals they had never encountered in their billion-year evolutionary history. The first visible sign of the approaching catastrophe appeared as a faint star in the western sky, visible only to the keenest eyes and only for those who happened to be looking in exactly the right direction. A few pterosaurs, soaring high on the thermals created by the warming landscape, may have glimpsed this new light among the familiar patterns of stars and planets. But it meant nothing to them, merely another point of brightness in the vast dome of sky that had remained essentially unchanged throughout their species' existence. The asteroid's surface temperature was rising rapidly now as it encountered the thicker layers of the upper atmosphere. The dark rock began to glow cherry red, then orange, as friction converted its tremendous kinetic energy into heat. A tail of ionized gas began to stream behind it, creating the first wisps of what would soon become a spectacular and terrifying light show visible across half the planet. On the ground below, the approaching evening brought its own spectacle of natural beauty. Herds of duck-billed dinosaurs gathered at riverside drinking spots, their movements creating ripples that caught and scattered the golden light of the setting sun. The water they drank was warm and mineral-rich, carrying nutrients from the erosion of ancient mountains and the decay of vast forests. This water would soon be boiled to steam, but for now it sustained life in all its magnificent diversity. Crocodilians that dwarfed their modern descendants slid into the shallows with barely a splash, their movements as graceful as they were deadly. These ancient predators, virtually unchanged since the early days of the dinosaurs, represented evolutionary success of a different kind. Where dinosaurs had diversified into countless forms and filled every available niche, crocodilians had perfected a single lifestyle so completely that millions of years passed without significant change to their basic body plan. Their patience was legendary, even among their own kind. A large individual might wait motionless for days, its eyes and nostrils barely breaking the surface, until the perfect opportunity presented itself. When it struck, the attack was over in seconds, powerful jaws clamping shut with force enough to crush the skull of a tyrannosaur. These were the apex predators of the water margin, rulers of the boundary between land and sea. In the deeper parts of the river, primitive fish pursued their own ancient strategies for survival. Early relatives of modern salmon fought their way upstream to spawning grounds that had been used by their ancestors for millions of years. Their journey was fraught with dangers that no longer exist in our modern world. From marine reptiles that could swallow them whole, to pterosaurs that dove from the sky like feathered missiles. The very chemistry of the water they swam through was different from our modern rivers and oceans. Higher levels of dissolved minerals created an environment that supported shell-forming creatures of incredible diversity. Freshwater mollusks built spiral shells that rivaled those of their marine cousins, while primitive arthropods scuttled across the river bottom in forms that would seem alien to modern eyes. As evening approached and the western sky began to take on the deep blue color that precedes sunset, the asteroid continued its relentless approach. Its surface was now glowing white-hot, and the tail of ionized particles streaming behind it had begun to interact with Earth's magnetic field in ways that created subtle auroras at the very edge of space. These ghostly lights, invisible to ground-based observers but brilliant to any hypothetical watcher in orbit, danced across the upper atmosphere in patterns that had never been seen before and would never be seen again. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the asteroid's passage was beginning to affect the navigation systems of migrating animals. Sea turtles the size of automobiles, making their way toward nesting beaches that had been used by their kind for millions of years, found their internal compasses spinning wildly. Some began swimming in circles, their ancient programming overwhelmed by signals that had no precedent in their evolutionary experience. Birds that normally roosted at sunset remained active and agitated, their circadian rhythms disrupted by the approaching electromagnetic storm. Flocks that should have been settling into their nightly rest instead wheeled through the sky in confused formations, their calls creating a cacophony that added to the growing sense of unease among all the creatures of the forest. The larger dinosaurs, those titans whose footsteps had shaken the earth for more than 100 million years, began to display behaviors that had no precedent in their long evolutionary history. Herds that normally spread out to feed during the evening hours instead huddled together in tight groups, their massive bodies forming protective circles around their youngest members. The adults lifted their heads frequently, testing the air with nostrils that detected chemical signatures they could not identify. Something fundamental was changing in the very fabric of their world, though none of them possessed the cognitive framework to understand what that change might mean. They responded with instincts honed by millions of years of survival, seeking safety in numbers and elevation, moving toward higher ground with an urgency that had no obvious cause. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath as the last rays of sunlight slanted through the canopy. Flowers that normally closed at sunset remained open, their petals trembling in a breeze that carried unfamiliar scents. Trees that had stood for centuries creaked and swayed, though the wind was no stronger than on any other evening. Even the insects fell silent, their constant buzz and chirp fading to an ominous quiet that made every other sound seem magnified. In this strange twilight, as the familiar world prepared for what it thought would be just another night, the approaching asteroid blazed ever brighter in the western sky. Soon, it would be visible to every creature on the daylight side of the planet, a new star growing brighter by the second as it carved its fiery path through the upper atmosphere. The age of dinosaurs was measured now, not in millions of years, but in minutes. The great herds that had migrated across continents, the predators that had ruled their domains with casual supremacy, the delicate ecosystem relationships that had been refined by eons of evolution, all were about to be tested by forces beyond anything in their experience. The countdown to transformation had begun, though no clock existed to measure the time that remained. In the growing darkness, punctuated now by the first faint glow of the approaching catastrophe, the last generation of the great reptiles went about their evening routines. They could not know that they were living through the final hours of an age, that the world their ancestors had shaped and been shaped by was about to end, not with the gradual change that had characterized all previous transitions, but with the violent finality of cosmic collision. The stage was set for the most dramatic transformation in the history of complex life on Earth, a moment that would divide geological time as sharply as a blade divides flesh from bone. Above them, growing brighter with each passing second, the instrument of that transformation continued its billion-year fall toward a rendezvous that would echo through eternity. The light in the western sky had grown from a pinprick to a brilliant star, brighter now than Venus at its most radiant. Across the ancient landscape, creatures that had never seen anything like it began to lift their heads toward the heavens. The pterosaurs were the first to notice, their aerial perspective giving them the clearest view of the approaching phenomenon. Their calls, sharp and urgent, cut through the evening air as they wheeled and dove in patterns that spoke of confusion and alarm. On the ground below, the great herbivorous dinosaurs felt the change as a tremor in their bones, a subsonic vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The Tyrannosaur matriarch, her massive frame silhouetted against the darkening forest, turned her scarred snout skyward for the first time that day. Her amber eyes, each the size of a dinner plate, reflected the growing light as she tried to process what she was seeing. In all her years as the apex predator of this domain, nothing in her genetic memory had prepared her for this moment. The asteroid was now close enough that its gravitational influence was beginning to affect the tides. Along the coastlines of the shallow Cretaceous seas, Water levels fluctuated in ways that confused the marine reptiles who had timed their hunting to the predictable rhythms of lunar cycles. Massive plesiosaurs, their serpentine necks breaking the surface in confusion, found themselves struggling against currents that flowed in impossible directions. The electromagnetic field surrounding the approaching object had grown strong enough to interfere with the bioelectrical systems that many creatures used for navigation and communication. Electric fish in the rivers found their senses overwhelmed by signals that had no natural source, while the primitive echolocation abilities of early bats became useless as their calls were scattered by ionospheric disturbances. High above the atmosphere, the asteroid's rocky surface was now heated to temperatures that would have melted steel. Fragments began to ablate from its leading edge, creating a streaming tail of molten droplets that painted a fiery streak across the star field. Each piece of debris, no matter how small, carried enough energy to excavate a crater the size of a city block when it eventually reached the surface. The first of these herald fragments struck the upper atmosphere with flashes of light that briefly outshone the stars. To any creature watching from below, it would have appeared as though the sky itself was catching fire, with meteors streaking downward in numbers that defied comprehension. The night was turning to day, but not the gentle day of sunrise. This was a harsh, alien illumination that cast everything in stark relief and threw shadows in directions that violated every natural law. In the forests where the great dinosaur herds had sought shelter, the trees themselves began to react to the changing conditions. Ancient conifers, their root systems extending deep into the earth, detected seismic vibrations that preceded the main impact by several minutes. Leaves rustled without wind, and branches swayed in response to pressure waves traveling through the ground faster than sound through air. The smaller creatures of the forest floor, those mammals and early birds whose survival depended on acute awareness of danger, began to exhibit behaviors that had no precedent in their evolutionary history. Some burrowed frantically into the soft earth, driven by instincts that told them to seek the deepest shelter possible. Others climbed toward the highest branches, as though elevation might provide escape from whatever was coming. A family of early primates, their large eyes perfectly adapted for night vision, huddled together in the crown of an ancient fig tree. Their sensitive fingers, designed for grasping branches and manipulating small objects, trembled as they felt vibrations transmitted through the wood itself. These tiny mammals, no larger than modern squirrels, carried within their genetic code the potential to evolve into creatures capable of understanding what was happening above them. But that understanding lay millions of years in a future they would never see. The ocean depths, usually insulated from surface disturbances, were experiencing their own form of chaos. Deep-sea creatures that lived in perpetual darkness found their world illuminated by bioluminescent displays of unprecedented intensity. Fish that normally produced only dim flashes of light began to glow like underwater fireworks, their photophores triggered by electromagnetic radiation, penetrating even the deepest waters. Ammonites, those mathematical marvels of spiral shell construction, found their buoyancy control systems failing as pressure waves rippled through the water column. Some rose involuntarily toward the surface, their precisely calculated shell chambers no longer able to maintain neutral buoyancy in water that was being compressed and released in rapid cycles. The great marine reptiles, rulers of their aquatic domain for millions of years, began to surface in numbers that turned the ocean into a writhing mass of prehistoric life. Mosasaurs broke through the waves with explosive force, their serpentine bodies gleaming in the unnatural light that now painted the entire sky. These were creatures that normally avoided the surface except to breathe, but some deeper instinct was driving them upward, toward air and space, as though they sought escape from their own element. The asteroid's glow had intensified to the point where it cast shadows on the ground below. Trees, rocks, and the massive forms of dinosaurs were outlined in sharp relief against a landscape that flickered between natural darkness and artificial noon. The light was not the warm, life-giving radiance of the sun, but something harsher and more alien, carrying wavelengths of radiation that had never touched the Earth's surface in such concentration. Plants that had evolved complex relationships with natural light cycles began to respond in ways that defied their programming. Flowers that should have closed at sunset remained open, their petals tracking the movement of this new star across the sky as though it were the sun itself. Night-blooming species began to open prematurely, confused by signals that triggered responses millions of years in the making. The very air began to change as the first wisps of vaporized asteroid material reached the upper atmosphere. Particles of rock and metal, heated to plasma temperatures, began to interact with atmospheric gases in ways that created new chemical compounds. The smell of the air itself was changing, taking on metallic and ozone-like qualities that no terrestrial creature had ever experienced. Insects, those masters of atmospheric navigation, found their flight patterns disrupted by air currents that moved in impossible directions. Swarms of primitive moths, normally attracted to the gentle light of the moon, began to spiral upward toward the growing brightness in the western sky. Their simple nervous systems, evolved to navigate by celestial landmarks, could not process the conflicting signals they were receiving. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the asteroid's passage was now strong enough to affect the nervous systems of larger animals. Creatures that depended on bioelectrical fields for muscle coordination began to experience tremors and spasms. Some dinosaurs stumbled as their nervous systems misfired, while others became hyperactive, their movements jerky and unpredictable. In the shallow seas where so much of Cretaceous life flourished, the water itself began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence. Microscopic plankton, stressed by electromagnetic radiation and pressure changes, released bioluminescent chemicals in a desperate attempt to communicate danger to their kind. The result was an ocean that seemed to burn with cold fire, its surface rippling with waves of blue and green light. The temperature was beginning to rise as thermal radiation from the approaching object heated the upper atmosphere. This warming effect would soon cascade downward, but for now it was felt only by the most sensitive creatures. High-altitude pterosaurs found the air warming around them in ways that disrupted their thermal navigation systems, forcing them to descend toward the ground in confused spirals. The great dinosaur herds, those magnificent aggregations that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for so long, began to break apart as individual animals responded differently to the growing crisis. Some moved toward higher ground, driven by instincts that associated elevation with safety. Others sought the deepest valleys and ravines, as though they could hide from the sky itself. Still others simply stood motionless, their massive forms frozen in confusion, as their nervous systems struggled to process sensory information that had no meaning in their evolutionary context. The asteroid was now close enough that its individual features became visible to the keenest eyes. What had appeared as a single point of light was revealed to be an irregular mass of rock and metal, tumbling end over end as it carved its fiery path through space. Its surface, heated to incandescence, showed the scars of billions of years of cosmic collisions, each crater and ridge a testament to the violent history of the solar system. Fragments continued to break away from the main body, each one blazing its own trail through the atmosphere. These pieces, ranging in size from pebbles to boulders, were already beginning to impact the surface in scattered locations around the globe. Each strike created a flash of light and a crater that would remain as evidence of this night, long after everything else had changed. The sound was the next element to arrive, though it was unlike any sound that had ever echoed across the Earth's surface. It began as a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, transmitted through the ground, the air, and the water simultaneously. This was not the focused noise of thunder or earthquake, but something more fundamental, the sound of space itself being torn apart by an object moving faster than anything in the terrestrial world. Animals with acute hearing were the first to be affected. Bats fell from their roosts, their echolocation systems overwhelmed by acoustic noise that covered every frequency they used for navigation. Small mammals pressed themselves against the ground, their sensitive ears detecting subsonic vibrations that spoke of forces beyond their comprehension. The great predators, those magnificent tyrannosaurs and other large carnivores that had ruled by strength and cunning, found themselves reduced to the same helpless confusion as their prey. Their powerful muscles, evolved to deliver devastating attacks, were useless against a threat that came from the sky itself. Some lifted their massive heads and roared challenges at the approaching light, their voices adding to the cacophony that now filled the air from horizon to horizon. In the rivers and lakes where so many species gathered to drink, the water began to slosh and ripple as seismic waves traveled through the Earth's crust. These were not the focused vibrations of earthquake activity, but something more diffuse and all-encompassing. The planet itself was beginning to ring like a struck bell, its entire mass responding to the gravitational influence of the approaching asteroid. Fish that lived in these freshwater habitats found themselves thrown about by currents that changed direction without warning. Some were stranded on banks that rose and fell with the seismic activity, while others were swept into new channels carved by the shifting landscape. The ordered world of river ecosystems, stable for millions of years, was beginning to dissolve into chaos. The asteroid's approach had reached the point where its gravitational field was strong enough to affect the Earth's rotation. The length of the day was changing, though by amounts too small for any creature to consciously notice. Time itself was being distorted by the presence of this cosmic visitor, stretching and compressing in ways that would have fascinated human physicists, but meant nothing to the creatures experiencing it. At the deepest level of reality, where matter and energy dance in patterns too small for eyes to see, the very atoms of the atmosphere were beginning to respond to the approaching catastrophe. Molecular bonds that had remained stable for millions of years were starting to vibrate in new frequencies, preparing for the chemical reactions that would soon transform the composition of the air itself. The last phase of the asteroid's approach was beginning, the final minutes before impact that would mark the end of one chapter in Earth's history and the violent beginning of another. Above the ancient world, where giants had walked in majesty for longer than mountains had stood, a mountain from space prepared to write the final sentence in their story with fire and stone and the unleashing of forces that would remake the very definition of what it meant to be alive on Earth. The brightness in the western sky had grown beyond anything that natural selection had prepared any earthly creature to witness. What had begun as a curious new star was now a blazing sun that painted the entire landscape in harsh, flickering light. Shadows danced and twisted as the tumbling asteroid caught and reflected its own incandescent glow, creating an alien aurora that stretched from horizon to horizon. The electromagnetic radiation preceding the impact was now intense enough to cause physical pain in creatures with sensitive nervous systems. Small mammals and birds began to experience seizures as their bioelectrical systems overloaded. Even the mighty dinosaurs, with their more primitive neural architecture, found their movements becoming erratic and uncontrolled as electromagnetic pulses interfered with the signals traveling between brain and muscle. In the oceans, the effect was even more dramatic. Marine creatures that relied on electroreception for hunting and navigation became completely disoriented. Sharks that had ruled the ancient seas for hundreds of millions of years found themselves swimming in circles, their legendary directional sense overwhelmed by electromagnetic noise that drowned out every natural signal they had evolved to detect. The temperature of the upper atmosphere was rising so rapidly that the normal circulation patterns of wind and weather began to break down. Air masses that should have moved in predictable directions instead churned in massive convection cells, creating wind shears and pressure gradients that no flying creature could navigate. Pterosaurs, those masters of prehistoric skies, began falling from the air as thermal columns collapsed and reformed without warning. On the ground, the great herbivorous herds that had migrated across continents following seasonal patterns older than memory itself found their ancient pathways disrupted by seismic activity. The very landscape was beginning to shift and buckle as gravitational tides from the approaching asteroid stressed the Earth's crust beyond its elastic limits. Valleys that had channeled rivers for millions of years suddenly rose to become hills, while mountain ridges cracked and subsided into new configurations. The asteroid's surface temperature had climbed beyond the melting point of rock. Its leading edge was now a plasma fireball that ionized the atmosphere for hundreds of miles in every direction. This expanding envelope of superheated gas began to interact with the Earth's magnetic field, creating electrical phenomena that lit up the entire sky with curtains of aurora-like brilliance that pulsed and writhed in patterns that had never existed before and would never exist again. Fragments of the disintegrating asteroid continued to rain down across the planet's surface, each impact adding to the growing chaos. These herald stones, heated to temperatures that would vaporize any organic material on contact, began to ignite fires in forests that had stood unchanged since the dawn of the Cretaceous period. The smoke from these scattered blazes began to merge into a pall that dimmed even the brilliant light of the approaching main body. The sound had evolved from a rumble to a roar that seemed to come from the very foundations of the Earth itself. This was not mere noise, but a physical force that shattered rock, toppled trees, and drove creatures to their knees through sheer acoustic pressure. The air itself became a weapon, compressed and rarefied in waves that travelled faster than any terrestrial creature could run. In the final minutes before impact, the asteroid's appearance changed once more. What had been a tumbling, irregular mass of rock became a sphere of pure energy, its surface so hot that it radiated light across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. X-rays and gamma rays, forms of radiation that had never reached the Earth's surface in such intensity, began to penetrate the atmosphere and interact with living tissue in ways that caused immediate cellular damage. Plants that had survived ice ages and volcanic winters began to wither as their photosynthetic apparatus was destroyed by radiation levels that exceeded anything in their evolutionary experience. The great forest that had provided shelter and sustenance for countless species began to die even before the impact, their leaves curling and blackening as cellular structures broke down under the assault of high-energy particles. The ocean itself began to glow as microscopic life forms died in numbers so vast that their bioluminescent death throes turned entire sea basins into pools of ghostly light. The complex food webs that had supported marine ecosystems for millions of years began to collapse from the bottom up as the foundation species succumbed to radiation poisoning and electromagnetic disruption. Even the Earth's magnetic field, that invisible shield that had protected life from cosmic radiation for billions of years, began to fluctuate and distort under the influence of the asteroid's metallic core. Compass needles spun wildly as magnetic north shifted by degrees, then by tens of degrees, as competing magnetic fields fought for dominance in the space between worlds. The final approach was now measured not in minutes, but in seconds. The asteroid, its mass equivalent to Mount Everest, but travelling at velocities that defied earthly comprehension, began to compress the atmosphere ahead of it into a wall of superheated gas. This atmospheric compression created temperatures that exceeded those found in the cores of stars, turning ordinary air into a plasma that glowed brighter than the surface of the sun. The creatures of the late Cretaceous world, those magnificent products of millions of years of patient evolution, faced their final moments with the same dignity that had characterized their long reign. Great tyrannosaurs stewing light, their massive forms silhouetted against a sky that had become an alien furnace, herd motionless in the blasts of ceratopsians, huddled together, their elaborate frills and horns providing no defense against a threat that came from beyond the atmosphere itself. In the forests where delicate ecosystems had reached pinnacles of complexity and beauty, the last of the feathered dinosaurs pressed close to their kin as the world around them began to transform into something unrecognizable. Their songs, those complex vocalizations that had carried meaning across vast distances and deep time, were drowned out by the growing roar of approaching catastrophe. The marine reptiles, those serpentine rulers of ancient seas, breached the surface in final displays of the power and grace that had defined their kind. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and giant sea turtles fought against currents that moved in impossible directions as the ocean itself was lifted and compressed by gravitational forces that had never before touched the Earth's surface. In the deepest ocean trenches, where pressure and darkness had created refuges that seemed beyond the reach of surface catastrophes, even the most primitive life forms began to feel the effects of the approaching impact. Bacterial mats that had remained unchanged for billions of years found their chemical processes disrupted by radiation that penetrated to the very floor of the sea. The moment of impact was now so close that individual seconds could be counted. The asteroid, its surface temperature exceeding 10,000 degrees, began to interact directly with the upper layers of the atmosphere. The collision between cosmic visitor and terrestrial air created a flash of light that would have been visible from the moon had there been eyes there to see it. This was the final instant of the Mesozoic era, the last heartbeat of an age that had seen the rise and flowering of the greatest terrestrial animals ever to walk the Earth. In laboratories of the future, scientists would mark this moment as one of the great punctuation marks in the history of life, a boundary as sharp and definitive as the edge of a blade. The asteroid struck the Earth at 23 degrees north latitude, 65 degrees west longitude, at a shallow angle that maximized the area of destruction. The impact site, a shallow sea off the coast of what would one day be called the Yucatan Peninsula, vaporized instantly as kinetic energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons was released in a fraction of a second. The explosion that followed was beyond the power of words to describe. Rock, water, and living tissue were converted to plasma in temperatures that briefly matched those found in the cores of stars. The impact crater, excavated in milliseconds, reached depths of 20 miles and diameters of over 100 miles, creating a wound in the Earth's crust that would remain visible for millions of years. But the direct destruction was only the beginning. The real catastrophe was just starting to unfold as the energy of impact began to propagate outward through every medium that could carry it. The age of dinosaurs had ended not with the gradual decline that characterized most extinctions, but with the sudden violence of cosmic collision, marking the boundary between one world and another with fire and stone, and the unleashing of forces that would echo through geological time. The shockwave from the impact traveled outward at speeds that compressed time itself into meaningless fragments. Within the first second, a hemisphere of superheated rock and vaporized seawater expanded from the crater at velocities that dwarfed the fastest hurricane winds ever recorded. This was not mere destruction, but the temporary suspension of physical laws as matter and energy danced in configurations that had never existed on Earth's surface. The first creatures to die were not those at ground zero, where death came too quickly for suffering, but those in a ring hundreds of miles from the impact site. Here, the shockwave arrived as a wall of compressed air moving faster than sound itself, an atmospheric tsunami that flattened forests and shattered bones before the victims even heard its approach. Ancient trees that had weathered ice ages and volcanic winters were snapped like twigs, their massive trunks converted to splinters in milliseconds. A family of Alamosaurus, those gentle giants whose necks had once reached into canopies 4 stories high, felt the ground beneath them liquefy as seismic waves turned solid rock into something that behaved like ocean swells. Their massive bodies, perfectly adapted for supporting tons of weight on stable ground, became helpless as the very concept of solid Earth dissolved around them. These creatures, whose ancestors had walked steadily across continents for millions of years, found themselves swimming in stone that moved like water. The electromagnetic pulse that followed the initial flash was strong enough to disrupt the bioelectrical systems of every complex organism within 1,000 miles. Dinosaurs that had survived the initial shockwave began to collapse as their nervous systems simply stopped functioning. Tyrannosaurs, those apex predators whose reflexes had been honed by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, found themselves paralyzed as electromagnetic interference severed the connections between thought and action. In the shallow seas surrounding the impact site, the water itself was momentarily absent. The explosion had carved a temporary cavity in the ocean, creating a hemisphere of vacuum surrounded by walls of displaced water that rose miles into the sky. Marine reptiles that had ruled these waters for eons found themselves suspended in air that glowed with residual heat, their bodies subjected to pressure changes that no aquatic creature had ever been designed to survive. The debris field from the impact began its own deadly journey skyward. Millions of tons of vaporized rock, launched at velocities that carried them beyond the reach of Earth's gravity, began to rain back down across the entire planet. These tiny droplets of molten stone, heated to temperatures that exceeded the melting point of steel, became a global shower of microscopic meteorites that ignited everything they touched. Forests that had never seen the flash of impact began to burn as this rain of fire descended from clear skies. In what would one day be North America, vast herds of triceratops looked up in confusion as their worlds began to glow with an alien light that fell like deadly snow. Each droplet, no larger than a raindrop but carrying the heat of a forge, set fire to ferns and conifers that had grown in peaceful shade since before their species had evolved. The atmospheric heating was so intense that the very air began to glow. Creatures still alive in regions thousands of miles from the impact found themselves breathing superheated gases that seared their lungs and throats. The oxygen-rich atmosphere that had supported the gigantism of the Mesozoic became a furnace that consumed everything it had once nourished. Pterosaurs fell from skies that had become too hot to support flight, their hollow bones unable to process air that carried temperatures normally found only in volcanic vents. In the deeper ocean basins, where pressure and distance might have provided some protection, the water column itself began to boil, not from direct heating, but from the rain of impact debris that continued to fall like a blanket of molten hail across every surface of the planet. The steam rose from seas that had remained stable for millions of years, creating clouds that blotted out what little natural light remained visible through the growing pall of smoke and vaporized rock. The sound of the impact, when it finally arrived in regions far from ground zero, was not the sharp crack of thunder or the rumble of earthquake, but something more fundamental. It was the sound of a planet screaming, transmitted through rock and air and water as the earth itself rang like a struck bell. This acoustic assault was powerful enough to shatter the delicate bones of small creatures and disorient the largest predators, adding another layer of chaos to a world already dissolving into primordial violence. Seismic waves from the impact began their journey around the globe, traveling through the Earth's crust at speeds that made them racing ahead of their own destruction. These were not ordinary earthquake tremors, but something more profound, carrying energies that had never before been concentrated in a single geological event. When these waves reached the opposite side of the planet, they would focus and amplify, creating secondary disasters in regions that had never felt the direct touch of cosmic collision. The great river systems that had carried life-giving water across the Cretaceous continents began to reverse their flow as the landscape tilted and buckled under seismic stress. Fish that had navigated these waterways for millions of generations found themselves swept inland as tsunamis born of crustal displacement carried ocean water hundreds of miles from its normal boundaries. The ordered geography of river deltas and coastal plains, stable since the early days of dinosaur evolution, was rewritten in minutes by forces that treated mountains like sand dunes. In the impact crater itself, a process was beginning that would create one of the most dramatic geological features in Earth's history. The rock that had been vaporized in the initial explosion began to condense and fall back into the cavity. But the energies involved were so vast that this material remained molten for hours. What emerged was not a simple hole in the ground, but a complex ring structure of melted and reformed stone that would puzzle geologists for millions of years. The debris ejected upward from the impact site reached heights that carried it beyond the atmosphere entirely. Some of this material, launched with enough velocity to escape Earth's gravity completely, began an interplanetary journey that would eventually deposit fragments of late Cretaceous Earth on the Moon, Mars, and perhaps even in the asteroid belt from which the impactor had originally come. In a cosmic sense, pieces of the dinosaur world were about to become citizens of the solar system at large. But most of the ejected material followed ballistic trajectories that brought it crashing back to Earth across the entire hemisphere facing the impact site. These secondary impacts, individually small but numbering in the millions, created a carpet bombing effect that extended the zone of direct destruction far beyond what the primary impact alone could have achieved. Each returning fragment carved its own small crater and added its own contribution to the growing global firestorm. The firestorm itself was unlike anything in the previous history of the planet. This was not the localized burning that followed volcanic eruptions or lightning strikes, but a simultaneous ignition of combustible material across entire continents. The oxygen-rich atmosphere that had sustained the giants of the Mesozoic became their funeral pyre, feeding fires that burned with intensities never before seen on Earth's surface. Smoke began to rise from burning forests in columns that reached the stratosphere, where it spread in vast plumes that began to block out the sun itself. The same atmospheric circulation patterns that had brought gentle rains and seasonal changes to the dinosaur world now worked to distribute the products of its destruction across the globe. Within hours, skies thousands of miles from the impact site began to darken as smoke and ash created an artificial twilight that would deepen into something approaching eternal night. The great herbivorous dinosaurs, those patient gardeners whose grazing had shaped entire ecosystems, found their food sources literally disappearing in flames around them. Plants that had evolved complex chemical defenses against being eaten were helpless against temperatures that reduced their tissues to ash within seconds. The elaborate relationships between flowering plants and their pollinators, refined over millions of years of coevolution, were severed as both partners in the dance of reproduction burned together in the growing conflagration. In regions where the fire had not yet arrived, animals began to exhibit behaviors that had no precedent in their evolutionary history. Predators and prey huddled together without aggression, their ancient antagonisms temporarily suspended by circumstances that transcended every survival strategy natural selection had ever developed. Tyrannosaurs stood beside Triceratops in mutual bewilderment, their roles as hunter and hunted rendered meaningless by a catastrophe that threatened everything equally. The smaller creatures, those mammals and early birds, whose survival had depended on remaining invisible to their gigantic neighbors, found their refuges in burrows and hollow trees providing unexpected salvation. Underground, insulated from the heat and chaos above, some were able to survive the initial firestorm, but even they would face challenges in the days to come that would test every adaptation their lineages had developed over millions of years of coexistence with the dinosaurs. The marine ecosystems, those vast underwater worlds that had seemed immune to terrestrial disasters, were experiencing their own form of apocalypse. The impact had generated tsunamis that dwarfed any wave in geological history. walls of water hundreds of feet high that swept across entire ocean basins. These liquid mountains carried with them everything in their path, from microscopic plankton to the largest marine reptiles, mixing the contents of different seas in a chaos of salt water, sediment, and dying life. When these mega tsunamis finally broke upon distant coastlines, they carried the ocean far inland, temporarily converting river valleys into seaways and mountaintops into islands. The careful zonation of marine life, from shallow water corals to deep sea creatures, was scrambled as organisms found themselves deposited in environments for which millions of years of evolution had not prepared them. The very chemistry of the oceans began to change as the impact debris continued to rain down into the water. Vaporized rock, rich in sulfur compounds and other chemicals, began to alter the pH of seawater in ways that threatened the shell-forming organisms that formed the base of marine food webs. Ammonites, those mathematical marvels whose spiral shells had been perfected over hundreds of millions of years, found their calcium carbonate homes beginning to dissolve in water that was becoming increasingly acidic. As the hours passed and the immediate violence of impact began to give way to longer-term consequences, the true scope of the catastrophe became apparent. This was not merely the death of individual creatures or even species, but the collapse of entire ecological systems that had taken millions of years to develop. The intricate web of relationships that had bound predator to prey, plant to pollinator, and habitat to inhabitant was being severed strand by strand as the fundamental conditions for life on Earth shifted beyond recognition. The sun, when it could be seen through the thickening pall of smoke and debris, appeared as a dim red disk that provided little warmth and even less light for photosynthesis. Plants that had survived the initial firestorm began to weaken and die as the energy source that had powered terrestrial ecosystems for billions of years was effectively blocked by the products of their own destruction. The great cycles of carbon and oxygen that had maintained atmospheric balance since the emergence of complex life began to falter as the primary producers that drove these cycles succumbed to darkness. In this twilight world, where the familiar rhythms of day and night had been replaced by an alien gloom, the last of the great dinosaurs wandered through landscapes they no longer recognized. Some died quickly, overwhelmed by heat, smoke, and the collapse of their food sources. Others lingered for days or weeks, their massive bodies slowly failing as the world they had been designed to inhabit disappeared around them. The Tyrannosaur matriarch, who had begun this day by leading her offspring through familiar territory, found herself alone in a forest of blackened stumps, the air thick with ash that coated her scarred hide in grey dust. Her keen senses, evolved to detect the slightest movement of prey in dense vegetation, were overwhelmed by the chemical chaos of a burning world. Even her legendary hunting abilities were useless in an environment where there was nothing left to hunt. Her calls, those deep reverberations that had once carried her voice across miles of forest, echoed unanswered through the smoke-filled air. The complex social structures that had bound Tyrannosaur family groups together for millions of years were dissolving as individuals scattered in search of resources that no longer existed. The apex predator of the Cretaceous world had become a refugee in her own domain, wandering through the ruins of an ecosystem that had once seemed eternal. The transformation was not yet complete, but already it was clear that the world emerging from this catastrophe would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed only hours before. The age of giants was ending not with the gradual decline that characterized most evolutionary transitions, but with the sudden violence of cosmic accident. In the growing darkness, lit only by the glow of distant fires and the occasional flash of still-falling debris, a new chapter in the history of life was about to begin. The survivors of that first hellish night faced a dawn that never came. Where the sun should have risen, only a deeper shade of grey crept across the sky, filtered through layers of ash and smoke that had turned the atmosphere into a suffocating shroud. The temperature, which had soared beyond endurance during the initial firestorm, now began its relentless descent toward a cold that would grip the planet for months to come. In the ruins of what had been lush forests, a few scattered dinosaurs moved like ghosts through the devastation. Their footsteps, once thunderous enough to shake the ground, now fell silently on ash so deep it muffled every sound. A lone Edmontosaurus, separated from its herd in the chaos of the previous day, wandered through the skeletal remains of trees that had provided food and shelter for its entire life. Its duck-like bill, perfectly designed for cropping tender vegetation, found nothing but charcoal and bitter dust. The great herbivore's calls, those resonant honks that had once carried across valleys to coordinate herd movements, went unanswered in the strange twilight. Its companions were gone, scattered or dead, leaving it to face a transformed world with instincts that had been shaped by millions of years of abundance. The social bonds that had given meaning to its existence had been severed as cleanly as if cut by a blade, leaving it adrift in a landscape that no longer resembled home. Water had become a precious commodity in this new world. The rivers that had meandered peacefully through Cretaceous valleys were choked with ash and debris. Their clear streams transformed into grey slurries that carried the taste of destruction. Those dinosaurs still alive found themselves competing for the few remaining pools of clean water, their territorial behaviours breaking down as desperation overrode the social structures that had governed their interactions for eons. A group of Parasaurolophus, their ornate head crests dulled with ash, gathered around a small spring that bubbled up from deep underground. These magnificent creatures, whose musical calls had once filled the air with haunting melodies, now stood in silence, their complex vocal communications reduced to simple grunts and huffs of exhaustion. The cultural traditions passed down through generations of their kind, the songs that had identified family groups and coordinated migrations, were dying with the singers who had preserved them. The sky above continued to darken as more debris fell from the upper atmosphere, each particle adding to the growing blanket that separated the Earth from its life-giving star. What little light penetrated this artificial night was tinged with red and orange, casting everything in the hellish glow of a world caught between fire and ice. The familiar blues and greens of the Cretaceous landscape had been replaced by a monochrome palette of grey ash and rust-coloured dust. In the oceans, the devastation was equally complete, but harder to see beneath the roiling surface. The tsunamis had passed, leaving behind a chaos of displaced water masses and confused currents that carried strange mixtures of deep-sea cold and surface warmth to places where they had never belonged. Marine creatures found themselves in alien environments, cold water species suddenly thrust into tropical zones, and warm water dwellers struggling to survive in frigid depths. The great mosasaurs, those serpentine rulers of the ancient seas, faced challenges that their millions of years of aquatic dominance had not prepared them for. The complex food webs that had sustained them were collapsing from the bottom up as microscopic plankton died in vast numbers, their photosynthetic processes disrupted by the absence of sunlight. Without these tiny organisms to convert sunlight into food, the entire marine ecosystem began to starve. Schools of ammonites, those spiral-shelled marvels of mathematical precision, drifted through waters that had become increasingly acidic as impact debris continued to alter ocean chemistry. Their shells, masterpieces of evolutionary engineering that had protected their soft bodies for hundreds of millions of years, began to weaken and dissolve as the pH of seawater dropped beyond the tolerance limits of calcium carbonate. These ancient mariners, survivors of previous mass extinctions, found themselves facing chemical changes that their lineage had never encountered. The pterosaurs, those masters of prehistoric skies, were among the first to succumb to the new conditions. Their hollow bones and efficient respiratory systems, perfectly adapted for life in the air, became liabilities in an atmosphere choked with particulates and toxic gases. Those few that survived the initial firestorm found themselves grounded, their wings clogged with ash that made flight impossible. Without the ability to soar on thermal currents and hunt from above, these aerial predators were reduced to scavenging on the ground, competing with terrestrial creatures for the dwindling resources that remained. The temperature continued its steady decline as the sun's rays were increasingly blocked by the thickening atmospheric shroud. What had been a greenhouse world, where palm trees grew near the poles and ice was virtually unknown, began its transformation into something resembling a nuclear winter. The first frosts appeared in regions that had never experienced freezing temperatures, killing the few plants that had survived the initial firestorm and adding another layer of stress to ecosystems already pushed beyond their breaking point. Small mammals, those humble creatures that had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs for millions of years, found their modest adaptations suddenly transformed into advantages. Their fur, evolved to provide insulation in the cool nights of the Mesozoic, now offered protection against the growing cold. Their ability to regulate body temperature internally, a trait that had once seemed insignificant compared to the impressive size and power of their reptilian neighbors, became a crucial survival tool in a world where external heat sources were rapidly disappearing. A family of early placental mammals, creatures no larger than modern shrews, huddled together in a burrow that had initially sheltered them from the heat of the impact. Now it protected them from the bitter cold that was beginning to penetrate even the deepest refuges. Their rapid metabolism, which had once been a disadvantage in a world of giants who could go weeks without eating, now allowed them to maintain vital functions, even as food became increasingly scarce. These tiny survivors possessed another crucial advantage that would serve them well in the months to come. Unlike the highly specialized dinosaurs, who had evolved specific dietary requirements and habitat preferences, the mammals were generalists. They could eat almost anything organic, from seeds and insects to carrion and plant matter. This dietary flexibility would prove invaluable in a world where traditional food sources had vanished, and survival depended on the ability to exploit whatever resources remained available. The great predators faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Tyrannosaurs, those apex hunters whose massive jaws had been designed to crush the bones of equally massive prey, found themselves in a world where such prey no longer existed. The herbivorous dinosaurs that had formed the foundation of their food web were dying in vast numbers, their bodies scattered across the landscape like monuments to a vanished age. Even when fresh meat was available, the effort required to locate it in the ash-covered wasteland often exceeded the energy it provided. A bull Tyrannosaurus rex, scarred veteran of countless territorial battles, stood motionless in what had once been a river valley teeming with prey. His massive frame, once a symbol of unstoppable power, now seemed almost pathetic against the backdrop of universal destruction. The keen intelligence that had made him a master hunter was helpless against a catastrophe that had eliminated not just his prey, but the entire ecosystem that had supported both predator and victim for millions of years. His mate and offspring were gone, lost in the chaos of the first day when families had been scattered by forces beyond comprehension. The complex social behaviors that had bound tyrannosaur groups together, passed down through generations of successful hunters, were becoming meaningless in a world where social cooperation could not overcome the fundamental absence of resources. Even the most sophisticated predatory strategies were useless when there was nothing left to hunt. The plant life that had formed the foundation of all terrestrial ecosystems was suffering its own form of apocalypse. The few trees and shrubs that had survived the initial firestorm were slowly dying as the absence of sunlight made photosynthesis impossible. Their leaves, evolutionary marvels that had perfected the art of converting light into life, turned brown and fell like snow in the perpetual twilight. Without these primary producers to convert carbon dioxide into oxygen, the very composition of the atmosphere began to shift toward concentrations that would challenge even the hardiest survivors. Flowering plants, those relative newcomers to the evolutionary stage who had been transforming terrestrial ecosystems since the early Cretaceous, found their complex relationships with pollinators severed by the mass death of insects and other small animals. The intricate partnerships between flowers and their visitors, refined over millions of years of coevolution, were dissolving as both partners in these ancient contracts succumbed to conditions that made their specialized interactions impossible to maintain. In the deeper parts of the ocean, where sunlight had never penetrated even in the best of times, some forms of life continued much as they had before the impact. Deep-sea bacteria and other microorganisms, sustained by chemical energy rather than solar radiation, found their existence relatively unchanged by the catastrophe raging above. These humble creatures, invisible to the naked eye but numbering in the trillions, would prove to be among the most important survivors of the extinction event, maintaining the basic chemical cycles that would eventually allow life to recover. But even in these abyssal refugees, the effects of the impact were beginning to make themselves felt. The massive amounts of debris that had been injected into the atmosphere were starting to settle out of the air and fall into the oceans, carrying with them chemical compounds that had never existed in such concentrations on Earth's surface. The rain that finally began to fall through the ash-laden atmosphere was acidic enough to etch stone, adding another layer of chemical stress to marine ecosystems already struggling with the collapse of their food webs. The few dinosaurs still clinging to life found themselves facing challenges that no amount of evolutionary adaptation could have prepared them for. A small herd of triceratops, their magnificent three-horned skulls now grey with ash, huddled together for warmth as the temperature continued to drop. These creatures, whose ancestors had survived ice ages and volcanic winters, were experiencing cold that penetrated deeper than their physiology could handle. Their reptilian metabolism, perfectly suited to the warm greenhouse world of the Cretaceous, began to slow and falter as their body temperatures dropped toward levels that would shut down essential functions. The youngest members of the herd were the first to succumb, their smaller bodies unable to maintain heat in the increasingly bitter cold. The adults watched helplessly as their offspring grew sluggish and still, their protective instincts useless against an enemy they could not fight or flee. The complex social behaviors that had evolved to protect the young from predators and environmental hazards were meaningless when the threat came from the sky itself, and could not be deterred by horns or armor or the combined strength of the herd. As the days passed without sunlight, the psychological stress on the survivors became as devastating as the physical challenges. Creatures that had evolved complex behaviors and social structures found themselves in situations that their genetic programming could not address. Migration routes that had been followed for millions of years led to destinations that no longer existed. Mating calls went unanswered, not because of rejection, but because there were no longer enough individuals left alive to maintain breeding populations. The soundscape of the world had changed as dramatically as its visual appearance. Where once the air had been filled with the calls of pterosaurs, the songs of early birds, and the complex vocalizations of dinosaur herds, now there was only an oppressive silence, broken occasionally by the crash of falling debris or the distant rumble of ongoing fires. The rich acoustic environment that had allowed creatures to communicate across vast distances had been replaced by a muffled quiet that seemed to absorb and deaden every sound. Those few early birds that had survived the initial catastrophe found their world transformed beyond recognition. Their songs, those complex melodies that had been refined over millions of years of sexual selection and territorial communication, echoed unanswered through forests of blackened stumps. The acoustic niches they had evolved to exploit were empty now, their competitors and partners alike eliminated by forces that made no distinction between predator and prey, singer and listener. A small flock of primitive songbirds, their feathers dulled with ash but their voices still clear, continued to sing in the growing darkness. Their melodies, carrying genetic memories of ancient forests and sunny meadows, seemed almost defiant in the face of universal destruction. These tiny creatures, whose dinosaurian heritage was written in every bone and scale, were unknowingly preserving musical traditions that would one day evolve into the dawn chorus of a recovered world millions of years in the future. The great marine reptiles were facing their own form of slow extinction in the altered oceans. Plesiosaurs, those serpentine giants whose long necks had been perfectly adapted for hunting in clear, well-lit waters, found themselves struggling to locate prey in seas that had turned dark and murky with suspended particles. Their sophisticated hunting strategies, evolved over millions of years of aquatic predation, were useless in an environment where visibility had been reduced to mere feet. The chemistry of the oceans continued to change as more impact debris dissolved into the water. Essential minerals that marine creatures had evolved to utilize were being diluted or converted into forms that their physiologies could not process. The careful balance of salts and nutrients that had maintained oceanic ecosystems for millions of years was being disrupted by an influx of materials that had never before existed in such quantities in Earth's surface waters. Microscopic marine life, the foundation of all oceanic food webs, began to die in numbers so vast that their decomposing bodies further altered water chemistry and depleted oxygen levels. The clear blue seas of the Cretaceous turned brown and stagnant as bacterial decomposition consumed the remaining dissolved oxygen, creating dead zones that spread like an infection through water that had once teemed with life. In the shallow coastal areas where so much marine diversity had flourished, the evidence of destruction was most visible. Coral-like reefs built by rudest bivalves lay exposed and dying as sea levels fluctuated wildly in response to the ongoing geological chaos. These underwater cities, which had taken millions of years to grow and had supported countless species, were being reduced to rubble by forces that operated on timescales too brief for their inhabitants to comprehend. The few large marine reptiles still alive found themselves in an ocean that no longer resembled their ancestral home. Mosasaurs, those supreme predators who had ruled the ancient seas with casual dominance, were reduced to scavenging the corpses of their own kind, as the living prey they had evolved to hunt disappeared into the growing marine wasteland. Their powerful jaws, designed to crush the shells of ammonites and the bones of fish, now served only to tear at carrion in waters that grew colder and more acidic with each passing day. As the first week after impact drew to a close, it became clear that this was not merely a temporary disruption from which the world would quickly recover. The fundamental conditions that had supported life on Earth for millions of years had been altered in ways that made recovery impossible for most existing species. The intricate web of ecological relationships that had bound the living world together was unraveling strand by strand, leaving behind a simplified and impoverished biosphere that bore little resemblance to the rich tapestry of life that had existed just days before. The great age of reptiles was ending not with the gradual decline that had characterized previous extinction events, but with the sudden collapse of entire ecosystems across the globe. In caves and burrows, in the depths of the ocean, and the few remaining pockets of relatively clean air, small populations of hardy species clung to life with a tenacity that would eventually prove to be the foundation for recovery. But that recovery lay millions of years in a future that none of the current participants in this drama would live to see. And when it came, it would be built on the bones of giants who had once ruled the earth with a magnificence that would never be equaled again. The darkness that had settled over the earth was unlike any night in the planet's history. This was not the gentle darkness of sunset, when creatures settled into their nests and burrows to await the return of dawn. This was something alien and absolute, a blackness so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself. The few survivors moved through this perpetual twilight like phantoms in a world that had become unrecognizable. A month had passed since the sky had caught fire, though the concept of time itself had lost much of its meaning in a world where day and night no longer existed. The survivors measured duration, not by the movement of sun and stars, but by the growing cold that penetrated deeper into their bones with each passing period of rest. What had been a warm, humid paradise was transforming into something that resembled the frozen wastes at the edge of the world. In what remained of a forest that had once echoed with the calls of countless species, a solitary Ankylosaurus moved with painful slowness through the ash-covered wasteland. Her armored hide, that masterpiece of defensive evolution, was now more burden than protection. The bony plates that had once deflected the attacks of the most powerful predators now conducted the bitter cold directly into her body, making her a prisoner within her own armor. The massive herbivore had not eaten in days. Her powerful beak, designed to crop tough vegetation with mechanical efficiency, found nothing but charcoal and dust when she lowered her head to search for food. The complex grinding teeth that had processed tons of plant matter throughout her life worked futilely against gritty ash that provided no nutrition and left her mouth dry and raw. Her stomach, adapted to digest the cellulose-rich diet that had sustained her kind for millions of years, cramped with emptiness. Behind her, barely visible in the grey twilight, lay the bodies of her herd mates. They had died one by one over the past weeks, their massive forms simply settling into the ash, as their metabolisms finally surrendered to conditions that made life impossible. She had remained with them long past the point where instinct should have driven her to seek better territory, her social bonds proving stronger than the survival imperative that had carried her lineage through countless challenges. The cold was the cruelest enemy. Where once she had basked in sunlight that warmed her blood and energized her movements, now every breath brought frigid air into lungs that were never designed to function at such low temperatures. Her reptilian physiology, perfectly tuned to the greenhouse world of the late Cretaceous, was shutting down system by system as her body temperature dropped below the threshold needed to maintain basic functions. Small creatures scurried through the ash around her feet, barely visible shadows that appeared and vanished like memories of life. These were the mammals, those humble inheritors of a world they had never sought to claim. Their fur-covered bodies, once insignificant compared to the magnificent scales and armor of their giant neighbors, now provided the insulation that meant the difference between life and death in the New World Order. A family of early primates, their large eyes adapted for night vision in the Cretaceous forests, found their abilities perfectly suited to the perpetual darkness that had engulfed the planet. They moved through the skeletal remains of trees with careful precision, their grasping hands and feet allowing them to navigate terrain that would have been impossible for larger creatures. Their diet, always opportunistic and varied, now included things that would have been unthinkable in the abundant world of just weeks before. These tiny survivors had discovered that the bodies of the fallen giants provided resources that could sustain them through the worst of the crisis. It was a grim irony that the death of the rulers of the Mesozoic was providing life for the creatures that would inherit their world. The mammals fed not with the casual efficiency of predators, but with the desperate hunger of scavengers in a world where every calorie might be the difference between survival and joining the growing number of the dead. The temperature continued its relentless descent as the sun remained hidden behind layers of debris that showed no sign of clearing. Ice began to form in regions that had never known frost, killing the last hardy plants that had managed to survive the initial firestorm. The complex chemical processes that had maintained atmospheric balance for millions of years ground to a halt as the primary producers that drove these cycles succumbed to the endless winter. In the oceans, a different kind of death was unfolding with equal finality. The last of the great marine reptiles drifted through waters that had become alien to them, their powerful bodies struggling against currents that carried the chemical signature of a planet in distress. The plesiosaurs, those graceful giants whose serpentine necks had been the marvels of their aquatic realm, found themselves in seas so murky and lifeless that their hunting strategies became meaningless. An elderly female Elasmosaurus, her neck scarred by decades of territorial disputes and mating displays, swam slowly through waters that tasted of metal and ash. Her small head, perfectly proportioned for capturing the swift fish and squid that had been her primary prey, now searched in vain through a liquid desert where life had become a rare and precious commodity. The sophisticated sonar-like abilities that had made her a master hunter were useless in water so thick with suspended particles that sound waves scattered, and died before they could return meaningful echoes. The great marine food webs that had sustained oceanic life for millions of years were collapsing from the bottom up. Microscopic plankton, those invisible engines of ocean productivity, had died in numbers so vast that their decomposing bodies created anoxic zones where nothing and carbon dioxide that had regulate could survive. The careful balance of oxygen-ocean chemistry since the dawn of complex life was dissolving into chaos as dead zones spread across entire sea basins. Ammonites, those mathematical marvels whose spiral shells had perfected the art of controlled buoyancy, found themselves unable to maintain their position in the water column as the chemistry around them shifted beyond the tolerance limits of their physiology. Their shells, those masterpieces of evolutionary engineering, began to weaken and dissolve as the pH of seawater dropped to levels that made calcium carbonate unstable. These ancient mariners, survivors of previous mass extinctions that had claimed countless other lineages, faced chemical changes that their hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary success could not overcome. The few mosasaurs still clinging to life in the altered oceans had been reduced to shadows of their former magnificence. These serpentine predators, whose powerful jaws had once crushed the shells of the largest ammonites with casual ease, now struggled to process the acidic water that burned their throats and gills. Their streamlined bodies, perfected for high-speed pursuit of agile prey, moved with increasing sluggishness as the cold penetrated even the deepest parts of the sea. On land, the silence was becoming absolute. The complex acoustic environment that had characterized the Cretaceous world, filled with the calls of countless species communicating across vast distances, had been replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle and absorb every sound. The few creatures still alive moved through this soundless landscape, like ghosts haunting the ruins of their own world. A small group of Parasaurolophus, their magnificent head crests dulled with ash and neglect, stood motionless beside what had once been a clear mountain stream. These creatures, whose musical calls had once carried across valleys in haunting harmonies that spoke of ancient social bonds, now stood in complete silence. Their hollow crests, those resonating chambers that had made them the musicians of the dinosaur world, remained unused as they conserved every bit of energy for the simple act of staying alive. The youngest member of the group, barely half-grown, had not uttered a sound in days. The complex vocalizations that should have been learned from elders and passed down through generations of cultural transmission were dying unspoken as the teachers succumbed one by one to the harsh new reality. Ancient songs that had echoed through millions of years of evolution were being lost forever, their melodies silenced, not by predation or competition, but by the simple absence of voices to carry them forward. The stream beside which they stood ran grey with ash and debris, its water too contaminated to drink safely. These herbivores, whose ancestors had migrated following the seasonal patterns of rainfall and plant growth, found themselves trapped in a landscape where the very concept of seasons had become meaningless. The cyclical abundance that had supported their massive herds for millions of years had been replaced by universal scarcity that made migration pointless and survival increasingly unlikely. Their digestive systems, evolved to process enormous quantities of plant matter with remarkable efficiency, were failing as they were forced to consume increasingly marginal food sources. Bark, roots, and even the decomposing remains of plants killed in the initial firestorm provided little nutrition and often carried toxins that further weakened their already compromised systems. The careful balance of gut bacteria that had allowed them to extract energy from cellulose was being disrupted by the alien chemistry of their new diet. In the deeper parts of what had once been vast forests, a few scattered tyrannosaurs wandered like lost souls through the ruins of their kingdom. These apex predators, whose lineage had ruled terrestrial ecosystems with unquestioned dominance, found themselves in the unprecedented position of having nothing left to hunt. The complex food webs that had sustained them, from the smallest prey animals to the massive herbivores that had been their primary targets, had collapsed so completely that even scavenging was becoming impossible. A massive bull Tyrannosaurus rex, his scarred hide telling the story of countless successful hunts, stood motionless in a clearing that had once been the heart of his territory. The sophisticated sensory apparatus that had made him the ultimate predator, his keen eyesight, acute hearing, and sensitive olfactory system, now provided only information about a world devoid of opportunity. The chemical signatures he had learned to associate with prey were absent from air that carried only the smell of ash and decay. His mate had died 3 weeks earlier, her massive body finally succumbing to starvation after their stored fat reserves had been exhausted. The complex social bonds that had united their family group, refined by millions of years of evolution into sophisticated cooperative behaviors, had proven meaningless in a world where cooperation could not create the resources necessary for survival. Even the most advanced predatory strategies were useless when the fundamental bases of the food web no longer existed. The great predator's movements had become increasingly sluggish as his metabolism slowed in response to the dropping temperatures. His massive jaws, capable of delivering bone-crushing bites that could have felled any creature in the Cretaceous world, hung slightly open as he panted in the thin, cold air. The powerful muscles that had once driven him forward at surprising speeds were beginning to waste away as his body consumed its own tissues in a desperate attempt to maintain basic functions. Around his feet, barely visible in the perpetual twilight, small mammals continued their patient work of inheriting the earth. These humble creatures, whose ancestors had lived in the shadows of giants for over 100 million years, were discovering that their modest adaptations were perfectly suited to the harsh new world that was emerging from the ashes of the old. Their ability to regulate their own body temperature, to eat almost anything organic, and to reproduce quickly were proving to be the keys to survival in an environment that had eliminated most of their spectacular neighbors. The irony was not lost on the few scientists who might have observed this transition had any existed to witness it. The meek were indeed inheriting the earth, not through conquest or competition, but through the simple virtue of being small, warm-blooded, and adaptable. The magnificent specializations that had made the dinosaurs the most successful terrestrial animals in Earth's history were becoming liabilities in a world where generalization and metabolic efficiency mattered more than size and power. As the weeks turned to months, the pattern of survival became increasingly clear. The largest animals were the first to die, their massive bodies requiring resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantities. The most specialized species followed, their narrow dietary requirements and habitat preferences becoming death sentences in a world where flexibility was the only viable survival strategy. Even the most intelligent dinosaurs, those whose complex behaviors and social structures had been the marvel of their age, found their cognitive sophistication useless against challenges that could not be solved through learning or cooperation. The plant communities that had formed the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems were undergoing their own form of transformation. The few species that survived were those with the most generalized requirements and the greatest tolerance for extreme conditions. Ferns, those ancient veterans of previous extinction events, began to emerge from underground root systems in scattered locations where the soil had retained enough moisture and nutrients to support growth. Their simple reproductive strategies and ability to photosynthesize in low-light conditions gave them crucial advantages over the more sophisticated flowering plants that had dominated Cretaceous landscapes. In the oceans, a similar pattern of simplification was taking place. The complex reef ecosystems that had supported incredible biodiversity were being replaced by bacterial mats and simple algae that could survive in the harsh chemical conditions of the post-impact seas. The intricate relationships between different species, refined over millions of years of coevolution, were being severed as the environmental conditions that had allowed such specialization no longer existed. The few large marine animals still alive were those with the most generalized diets and the greatest tolerance for environmental variation. Some sharks, those ancient and conservative predators whose basic body plan had remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, found their lack of specialization to be a crucial advantage. Their ability to eat almost anything and their relatively simple habitat requirements allowed them to survive in waters that had become uninhabitable for more specialized marine reptiles. Deep in the ocean trenches, where sunlight had never penetrated even in the best of times, life continued much as it had before the catastrophe. Bacteria and other microorganisms that derived their energy from chemical processes rather than photosynthesis were largely unaffected by the changes taking place on the surface. These humble creatures, invisible to the naked eye, but essential to the planet's chemical cycles, would prove to be among the most important survivors of the extinction event. The global temperature continued to drop as the debris in the atmosphere showed no signs of settling. What had begun as a nuclear winter was developing into something approaching a full ice age, with temperatures falling so low that even the most cold-adapted species were being pushed beyond their tolerance limits. Ice began to form in regions that had been tropical just months before, adding another layer of stress to ecosystems already stretched beyond their breaking point. The few remaining dinosaurs faced a cruel irony. They had evolved during the Mesozoic era, a time of unprecedented warmth and stability when the Earth's climate had remained relatively constant for millions of years. Their physiology, behavior, and ecology were all perfectly adapted to greenhouse conditions that had seemed as permanent as the continents themselves. Now, in the space of a few months, they were being asked to adapt to conditions more extreme than anything their lineage had ever encountered. The psychological stress on the survivors was as devastating as the physical challenges. Creatures that had evolved complex social behaviors and intricate mating rituals found themselves in situations that their genetic programming could not address. Migration routes that had been followed for millions of years led to destinations that no longer existed. Territorial behaviors became meaningless when there were no longer enough individuals to maintain viable populations. The soundscape of the world continued to simplify as species after species fell silent forever. The rich acoustic environment that had allowed different creatures to communicate across vast distances was being replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to absorb and deaden every sound. The few calls that still echoed through the darkness carried notes of desperation rather than the confident declarations of territory and identity that had characterized the voices of the Mesozoic world. In isolated pockets around the globe, small populations of hardy species continued to cling to existence with a tenacity that would eventually prove to be the foundation for recovery. But that recovery lay millions of years in a future that none of the current survivors would live to see. The world that would eventually emerge from this catastrophe would be built on entirely different principles, dominated by creatures whose ancestors had been insignificant players in the Cretaceous drama. The Great Age of Reptiles was drawing to its close not with the gradual decline that had characterized previous evolutionary transitions, but with the sudden and violent collapse of entire ecosystems. The magnificent creatures that had ruled the Earth for more than 160 million years were becoming memories, their forms preserved only in the fossil record that would puzzle and inspire future generations of scientists who would piece together the story of their rise and fall from fragments of bone and stone. In the growing cold and darkness, the last Tyrannosaur lifted her massive head one final time, her amber eyes reflecting the dim glow of distant fires that still burned in the ruins of the world she had known. Her breath, visible in the frigid air, was perhaps the final exhalation of her lineage, the last whisper of an evolutionary experiment that had achieved heights of magnificence that would never be equaled again. The day the Tyrannosaurus rex vanished was not marked by any ceremony or recognition. It passed as quietly as the extinction of countless other species, noted only by the absence of footprints in the ash, the silence where once there had been mighty roars, and the slow settling of bones into sediments that would preserve them as monuments to a lost world. The crown had passed to creatures so small and humble that the dying giants barely noticed their presence. But these new inheritors would prove to have a staying power that would carry them through the long darkness ahead and into a future that would be shaped by entirely different rules. And so we reach the end of our journey through that final day, when the earth itself was rewritten in fire and stone and the silence that followed. We have walked beside the last Tyrannosaurs as they wandered through forests that would never see another spring, watched the final pterosaurs fall from skies that had become too hostile for flight, and witnessed the closing of evolutionary chapters that had been writing themselves for more than 100 million years. The story we have shared tonight is both an ending and a beginning. It marks the boundary between the age of reptiles and the age of mammals, between one experiment in life and another. In the darkness that followed that cosmic collision, small creatures with fur and warm blood inherited a world that had once belonged to giants. They carried forward not through conquest or superior design, but through the simple virtues of being small, adaptable, and patient enough to endure what could not be changed. From the ashes of the Cretaceous world would eventually rise forests filled with flowers that no dinosaur ever saw, skies crossed by birds whose songs carried melodies refined from the last calls of their distant cousins, and eventually creatures capable of looking back through deep time to understand what had been lost and what had been gained in that moment of transformation. The dinosaurs did not truly vanish that day. They live on in the sparrows outside your window, in the eagles that soar above mountains, in every bird that greets the dawn with song. The Tyrannosaur's lineage flows through creatures that learn to fly, carrying forward an unbroken chain of inheritance that stretches from the Mesozoic forests to your own backyard. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, remember that you too are part of this continuing story, descended from those small mammals who survived the darkness and cold to see the sun rise again on a transformed world. The same patient forces that shaped their destiny continue to shape ours, writing new chapters in the endless book of life with the same careful hand that once guided giants through ancient forests. Sleep well, friends, and dream perhaps of that lost world of wonders, knowing that its legacy lives on in forms both familiar and strange, in the turning of seasons and the songs of morning birds, in the very breath you draw and the warmth that keeps you safe through the night.